Never have so many alcoholic beverages.
Yeah, seriously.
No, it was.
It's gonna be outside garage, there's no permit.
That's fine.
That's the.
Good.
Low overhead.
Very low overhead.
There should be called a cable act, which,
Either public or governmental. Everybody agrees.
Yeah, yes, why, I was curious why the below police officers noticed enforcement field.
I know.
Because they're forced to get.
The vehicle code, we have a state highway, Highway 29, which we have control. It says no stopping or standing or parking at any time.
Okay, we will.
5 feet.
Mr. Doswell.
Flowers.
Mr. Doswell.
Yes.
Hi. We'll call to order now the Planning Commission meeting for May 28th. The City of Winters. Dago, would you do the roll call, please?
Commissioner Adam?
Here.
Altamiro? Here. Montana?
Here.
Rupp?
Here.
Riley? Vice Chair Baker?
Here.
Chairman Meyer?
Here. Matthew, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, three of us commissioners got to go to a training session on May 18th, and they had, we got, I think, a lot of good input, and one of the ideas we came away with was, and tonight we have some people here, is at each meeting explaining kind of what goes on in a planning commission meeting, especially if this is the first time you've been here and not familiar with it. We take public input, which is anything you want to let the commission know that doesn't have anything to do with the two items on the agenda tonight, which is the short-term rental ordinance and these housing issues that the city is dealing with. And if you would like to do, well, when we open that up, if you'd like to do that, or if you want to make a comment on these two issues when you get to them, you come to the podium, let us know your name and your address. Technically, there's a 3-minute limit. I've never seen it imposed at any time because we want to hear whatever you have to say. So at this time, we will open it up for citizen input on anything other than the two items. And will that include Matthew?
Oh, am I the only one that's submitted?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I get that then.
Hi, I'm Matt Keys with the Winters Express. I'm sad to say this will be my last meeting, which is why I'm addressing all of you. I don't think I've ever addressed the Planning Commission. I've been the City Council a couple of times, but I don't think I've ever addressed the Planning Commission. Wasn't on the sheet of paper, but I did want to start off today with a clarification on a story that I ran actually on my last official day at the newspaper, which was beginning of May. The last story that I published as an employee was about one of the topics that we're voting on tonight. And in the story that ran in print, I said one of the commission members did not return a request for comment from me, and that was Chair Meyer, and that was incorrect. So I wanted to clarify for the record, officially, since I don't think the correction actually ran in the paper.
It was online and appreciated.
The online version did include it. Chairman Meyer thankfully contacted us via comment and said, I didn't get a request for comment, and that was correct. That was my error. It was an email typo in the address. There was a intention to reach out. We intend to be fair and accurate in our reporting. It was an honest mistake, but it was still a mistake. And unfortunately, it will live in perpetuity in our archive. So maybe YouTube will be around in a couple hundred years when researchers are looking back at the issue of Airbnb, and they can see this apology and correction. So thankfully, if you do read the online story, Chairman Meyer was willing to offer us comment after the fact, and that version is updated. And if you're following the issue, please do. That having been said, as mentioned at the top, this will be my last meeting covering the Winters Planning Commission. When I took this job, in fact, I think it was this time last year, last May, my original role was not to be the city government reporter. It was to be the city's business reporter and general news reporter. And as I mentioned at the city council, while I would have liked to have said I took this job based on merit, it was actually inherited due to some pretty tragic circumstances, which I won't dive into today. I think everybody is familiar with what I'm referring to. But I inherited the job and came here, tried to make it every meeting. I think I did a pretty good job. It's pretty easy when there's only one meeting out of the month, right? I took on a new job earlier this month in Sacramento and left the Express officially on May 6th. And we'll be leaving permanently after this meeting. This is the last, I think this is the last assignment I have, aside from an interview later in the week. Let me tell you, the commute from Sacramento was really interesting. Ideally, I would have introduced our new city reporter, Brandon McCapes. Some of you may have been introduced via the YouTube stream last week, and some of you may have seen his name appear in the paper. He will be my replacement here. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it tonight because of a personal scheduling conflict, but he will be at the next meeting in June. And please feel free to swing by the office if you would like to get in, or I'll arrange an introduction by email. And with those final moments, I wanted to thank everybody who's before me today, everybody in city government on staff, from our city manager to our planning secretary to all of the commissioners before me. Everybody has been very willing to provide comment and clarify things when I've needed it, and as well as the city staff who's behind me. If we had any material that we needed to advance our stories, they've always been delivered in a very timely manner, despite some of the coverage that may have appeared in the paper. I don't know, might have caused some people some heartburn, and I certainly understand that. And I was unfortunately remiss at my last in my last comments before the city council in thanking the Winters community in general, and it seems appropriate to do so at my last meeting for the paper. Some of you are familiar with my background before I came to Winters. If you're not, you can Google my name. It's pretty hard to escape. And I have various thoughts on that, which I won't get into, but if you'd like to hear them, find me. I came here after a pretty lengthy absence from journalism, and wasn't even sure if I wanted to get back into reporting the news. I wasn't sure if there was a position for me in doing so. And Taylor Bewley, our publisher and chief technology officer, reached out to me last April and said, hey, we have a position opening up the paper. And we're taking the paper in a new direction. And I jumped at the opportunity because I live right down the road. The commute would be really great from Vacaville. But I really fell in love with this town. I didn't know a whole lot about Winters. I came here for the tacos at El Pueblo. And that was about it. And the more you get to know the city, the more it becomes very apparent this is a special place to live, to work, and to visit. I hope that the stories that I wrote were not just seen as watchdog journalism, but really demonstrate the value of how special Winters is. And for me, it was a second chance to do something that I felt like I was put here to do. So it will always have a special place in my heart anyway. And I would encourage everybody in government and everybody in the city to remember that when they're speaking to me for the next 2 days, or Brandon for however long he's here, or anybody at the paper, that they're speaking to the community in general. We're just a vessel to get information out. So thank you all for your willingness to speak with me. Thank you to the community in general for being so inviting. And I look forward to visiting in my new capacity at the new place and every weekend that I have free and then I'm home. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Any other input, citizen input? Seeing none, we'll move on to consent items. Minutes, any comments on the minutes? Hopefully you're not reading them for the first time.
Chairman, I have one, there's a quote in here where either I zoned out without noticing it, or the last piece was left off. I don't know if it, because it just says beneficial to, with no other.
Oh, where's that?
At the very end,
Yeah.
I don't remember saying exactly that, but I would maybe just take a second look at what the context was.
Reread the audio.
Oh, I believe it is beneficial to limit the number. I don't know.
Not
So-
limit the number.
Jago, you can dig back into that and correct it.
I'll review the audio.
All right.
Probably it's missing. Looks like the word no is missing, huh?
Do we have,
I would just hold it over and we'll go through it to the next meeting, so that we might have that down.
okay. That sounds good. Thank you. Okay, we will now move on to the public hearing and consideration of the recommendations on the vacation rental ordinance. And Dave Adams will recuse himself from this. But he'll be back.
You will be. So good evening. This is a continuation sort of the discussion that's taken place for a number of meetings beginning last July, having to do with preparing a vacation rental ordinance, as the chair mentioned. Sure I did here. Anyhow. This ordinance would be an attempt to regulate the type of businesses now that have become very popular, Airbnb being the largest of those. We've had a number of planning commission meetings, the most recent being last month. At the meetings or at the various meetings that preceded it, the commission has sort of incrementally directed staff to either consider or make changes to the ordinance in the draft form, so that eventually when it goes on to the city council, it includes as many of your suggested changes. At the last meeting, Jose Benuelos, who's one of the neighbors living near an existing Airbnb, spoke about some of the issues that he faced. Also, Sandy Vickery spoke at that meeting as well. She had asked that there would be an opportunity to meet with staff to go over some of her concerns that she felt needed to be addressed or should be at least looked at by the city before proceeding on adopting an ordinance or recommending adoption of an ordinance. I've met with her on 2 different occasions. I met with her on May 2nd and also last Thursday, May 22nd. We were looking at the ordinance at ways, based on really her conversation, to simplify, clarify, and in some cases eliminate language that's either duplicative or unnecessary because it's covered elsewhere in city codes. And I've summarized in the staff report those issues that we were able to reach somewhat of a consensus on, and I've explained in most instances why I supported the change, and I've incorporated that into the draft ordinance that you have in front of you tonight. I mean, I'll highlight a couple of them. One was we had talked about how do you determine parking, and we had used a 2 guests as a number to determine a parking demand. And she brought up the fact, well, what happens if 4 people come in a car? You know, you're going to require 2 parking spaces for 4 people, and it obviously made a lot of sense. And so we just simplified it down to parking will be based on parking. So when the Airbnb unit becomes available and the person goes through the entitlement process, staff will work with them to identify how many parking spaces they can provide, and then it'll be somewhat on the owner-operator, owner-manager of the Airbnb to make sure that the guests don't show up with more cars than the site's capable of supporting. One of the other things that we looked at that I thought made sense to leading was the requirement that, and this comes from the city of Napa, that after the commission makes a decision, we then turn around and notify the same property owners within 300 feet of what your decision was. And I mentioned in the staff report that we don't do that for any other entitlement. And it seemed to be maybe a little bit over the top, because if you've notified the people of the public hearing, they have an opportunity, obviously, to call after the fact or contact the city after the fact and say, well, what was the outcome? I couldn't come to the meeting. And we obviously convey that to them. And they would still obviously have the ability to appeal. So that was another change that we proposed. At the April 23rd meeting, Commissioner Contreras talked about not wanting to put a limit on the number of guests that could stay at a non-hosted facility, which are the ones that would be subject to a conditional use permit to come before the planning commission. He had asked that in the draft ordinance that you ultimately will recommend an action under the council, that there would be language that would allow for a number to be placed on the number as to how many people can stay there by the planning commission as part of the use permit process. And you'll see in the draft ordinance that I've added that language. So ultimately, if the majority of the commission, and I think I heard that, I think Commissioner Contreras knows that, will recommend that there is a cap, at least there's an opportunity for the city council to be made aware of an alternative way to handle that particular situation. Lastly, you have a letter from Sandy Meyer that she delivered to me last week on the
Sandy
Vickery, sorry.
We're close, but okay.
Yeah, no. Sandy Meyer is a totally different person in a different place. But anyway, Sandy Vickery delivered, basically asking for you not to rush to a decision tonight. We all know you're not rushing. This has gone on, like I said, almost a year. She's out of town. We were unable to complete the review process. We got through probably about 75% of it. And we needed to finish the last 25%. We literally ran out of time last Thursday. And so she's asked that you give her another opportunity to meet with staff to sort of complete that review. I'm fine with that. She'll be back June 9th. If you were to agree with her request and continue the meeting, I'm not back June 9th. Oh, you could continue it to a date certain, and then you wouldn't have to renotice it. So that would cover the legal notice obligation. Does that not work?
That was my concern, if you were gonna pay for us to rerun the ad and go through the debacle.
No.
Yeah, we weren't gonna
By
do that.
law, you can legally continue to a date certain.
Okay, without further notice.
Correct. It's only where you just decide, we're just gonna table this for 6 months, then obviously we couldn't do that. But if you're comfortable with delaying it one more month as she's requested, then you would simply take an action at the end of the meeting to do so. And that's pretty much it. I'm here to answer any questions about either the languages involving the changes that she and I came to some agreement on, or anything else that you may want me to try to answer.
Commissioners, questions, observations before we open up to public comment? I have a few. First of all, I know Sandy's not here, but I'm sure she'll be following up on what we do tonight. And I'd like to thank her. Very often when city government is doing something, someone's unhappy, they complain, but that's all they do is complain. And she was not pleased with how it was put together. She took the time to work through it, meet with Dave, and that's great. She took very constructive steps to actually, I think, improve the ordinances before us, and so I'd like to thank her for that. In a current posting on the Express, it indicates that the complaints seem to be from 2 commissioners, and I wanted to clarify that as a planning commissioner, just like as a city manager or as a city council member, people often come up and talk to you and mention things to you and tell you about problems they think should be fixed and whatever. And my observations were from my neighbors coming up to me as a planning commissioner. They were not just me complaining about noise over my back fence. I'm actually all the way down at the end of the block from the Airbnb in our neighborhood. These are what has been passed on is actually residents of Winters voicing their displeasure with what's been going on, including less than in the last 2 weeks at that particular Airbnb, a fairly good-sized bus rented it for the night with a group of what appear to be construction people working on a job nearby, probably. Over a dozen. They had a trailer behind the bus with their tools. They stayed overnight. Young, hardworking guys making good money, and they partied late into the night. The immediate neighbor asked them numerous times to be quiet, and then he later told me about what happened. And I said, why didn't you call the police? He said, got partying people over there. It's 12:30 in the morning. If the police show up, they know who called them. And so I come out in the morning and my car is sitting in the driveway and there's something happened to my car. I'm not going to call them. So part of what we were trying to accomplish is to put the burden of proper management of these facilities where it belongs, which is on the owner of the property, not on the neighbors next door who have to endure the things that go on when they aren't managed. He did text the owner, who answered back the next day and said, I'm sorry, I was on a plane flying from Seattle to San Francisco where he lives. And he said, I'll do something about it, except the people were already gone and there's nothing to do about it. He has no consequence from what the neighbors endured there. This last Saturday, the house was full and there were 6 cars parked there, which the ordinance addresses. The house does not have parking for 6 cars. So they were all over the street, and they were in the morning when they were all leaving, all the cars were being loaded up, and it was very easy to go out there and count the number of people. So I am so pleased that we are now a year later getting to the point of where where we're actually maybe going to vote on an ordinance. I have some other comments which I'll save till after public comment. And why don't we open this up now to public comment at 6:51. And we have folks. Abigail Vargas, ladies first.
Thanks. Thank you, commissioners. Apparently I talked at the wrong meeting a month ago about my concerns with the ordinance. So I will try to address what I had brought up then, and I've done a little research since then. And I do apologize, I'll try not to be too nervous. I don't talk publicly very often. So my husband and I moved to Winters almost a year ago. We own a house with a detached in-law unit, which we plan to use as a short-term rental part-time. Our situation is that in the next 5 years, we expect one of our aging parents to come live with us, which was one of the reasons that we bought the property. And until that time, we want them to be able to use it because we don't have a downstairs bedroom or bathroom, and they can't use stairs. So when they're not visiting us, we would like to be able to supplement our mortgage income with the income from renting it. I am new to Winters. However, I am a 5th generation Northern Californian from Mendocino and Humboldt County, and I'm familiar with small towns. I grew up in a tourist area, smaller than Winters, called Anderson Valley, which is why we chose to move back to a small town from Elk Grove of 15 years. I am sympathetic to the balancing the needs of local residents with offering amenities to tourist trade, which provides income opportunities to the town. When I read that the commission was using the Napa short-term rental ordinance as a template, I was concerned about the impact of that decision. I see Napa as a world-renowned travel destination that has a very conservative local residential culture, and I don't see Winters coming even close to that. The listings for Napa are over 300, while ours And I'm sure not all of that's in the city limits. Ours, I think, are about 28, which I don't think all of them are in the city limits either. So I was surprised to see that you would choose such a restrictive template to base your decision on. So I did do some research also, looking for towns that were similar to Winters, and to see if they had ordinances also. What I discovered is that Yolo County is one of the few that do not have a short-term rental ordinance. And the only town that I could find was Davis, within Yolo County. Which we all know it's a college town, so I'm sure they have reasons to have that ordinance. I quickly reviewed 20 different ordinances throughout Northern California, and I found that there was a big range. Some were less restrictive ordinance set up mainly to collect the transient tax, and other ordinances were to completely ban any short-term rentals. I'm getting nervous. Winters proposed your ordinance that's in the draft that I read that came with the agenda online, to me seems to be very restrictive. And I'm not sure if I understand how the fees were being proposed, but it seemed also to be very high compared to what a lot of the other towns were offering. The closest town I could find that had 7,000 residents was Cloverdale in Sonoma County that did have a ordinance. And the fee was for a hosted rental was $530 for a plot plan review. And the fees for non-hosted was roughly $2,600 for a conditional use permit. Some other towns I reviewed, City of Auburn had a $57 fee. A notable part of their ordinance is that they must have a signed petition from all the neighbors submitted with the application approving the use of the house or residence. Nevada City had a $100 fee. Petaluma you had to get a business license and a one-time application fee for $334. Redding was $300. Some other similar towns to Winters did not have ordinances. Lodi, Placerville, Jackson, Angels Camp, Grass Valley, and Rio Vista. So I'm not really in favor of this ordinance. I don't see that it's necessary. I would like to comment on your neighbor situation where he did not call the police. He could have had the exact same situation with a neighbor that lived there. And if he had chosen not to call the police, it would have continued. And a neighbor living there may have also retaliated anyway. Sorry.
You're doing fine.
Okay. Try not to.
No worries.
I know they're probably late to the discussion, and that you're probably going to do an ordinance anyways, or propose one to the city council. I did have a couple issues. My situation would be a hosted rental. And so I did make a couple notes on the proposals of changes that I would like to recommend. I don't know if I do that now or.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I do apologize because when I printed this out, it seemed like a lot of portions of it got cut off.
That was our scanning.
Yeah, so some of it I don't.
You were not alone in that.
Okay.
Yeah. There were difficulties with printing from the,
There were some, well, I'm not sure where this is. I think it's under definitions, section 17.54.020. It talked about hosted accommodations, means a vacation rental for which the owner resides at the vacation rental unit and the owner sleeps at the vacation rental unit while being rented. I was unclear throughout the whole document, and it's mentioned a couple times, that I have a detached unit. So I was confused in reading that it sounded as if I would be a non-hosted situation. And I'm hoping,
Mr. Doswell shaking his
You
head
live on the
no.
property.
Yeah.
okay,
That's all that you have to do to be
Okay.
hosted.
okay,
Is it a permitted
yes.
detachment? Okay, good.
It's not a trailer,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah,
not
yeah.
a homemade shack,
That's
so,
good.
yes.
So yeah, that would not be, you would be a hosted,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
and let me throw in, just so you're, the fee is a one-time fee.
yes,
And the fee is set, the city has to make their fees line up with what the city cost is.
right,
It's not an arbitrary
right,
number designed to either encourage or discourage anything.
Right.
And there's consultants who figure out fees for cities, so.
well, and I think what I was, trying to allude to is that a lot of the cities weren't using the planning commission as part of their ordinance, therefore the fee was a lot less.
Mhm.
And that, I was hoping maybe you guys would consider also of doing a less restrictive ordinance that isn't so, puts a huge burden on the owner.
The planning commission's only involved in either a non-hosted one,
Okay,
or one where the city staff and the applicant can't agree on how it's going to work, and then the
Okay.
applicant's given the opportunity to appeal to the planning.
so that again, I was a little bit confused in reading it.
Can I interrupt for 1 minute? Sorry.
Oh, yes.
To your point, this might have just been my confusion, but Dave, under F, number 4, it says that it's a violation of the section for any accessory dwelling unit to be used. And I might have
Yes,
just been confused
that's
in there,
where,
but
No, that language is in there.
so that's what made me confused.
Well, I will be honest, not to take this the wrong way, but I would be honest, or not being honest with you, that's really not what accessory dwelling units are intended for.
Okay.
They're not designed to be a way to essentially turn them into rental properties for Airbnb. They're supposed to provide affordable housing. But there is nothing in the ADU law that I'm aware of that precludes it from doing it. So if the commission doesn't want to see that kind of language in here, then that would be something we direct us to remove.
will the use of it as an Airbnb affect us in a different, like, will it reduce our number somehow that has other consequences? Or, because that really threw me off.
I don't even know if Dan knows the answer to that question, whether an Airbnb qualifies as affordable housing. I doubt that it does.
Yeah, but assume not, but that unit was counted towards our affordable
They
housing.
typically are, yes, they are.
Are using your ADUs to make your arena requirement?
We typically do in most cities that I've worked in. I don't know if we do here.
So that would be,
Theoretically, one
Yeah.
less unit in the scheme of things. But again, she lives on the property, which is an obligation of an ADU, that you live on the property. And you can't be an absentee landlord.
are all freestanding units in our count? I mean, aren't there some in the city that are?
Well, I mean, there are some that are counted, and then there are some based on our track record that are presumed will occur during the next cycle. So let's say in this last housing cycle, we built 8 ADUs, then Dan, in working with his RENA number, would guesstimate that 8 would be a reasonable number to expect, in the next timeframe.
So it sounds like there might be some complications in that, and the staff's gonna dig a little deeper on that.
Okay,
But you can sleep in that unit anytime.
yes, I do.
And let them stay in your house.
Yeah, you can clearly flip it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, let's see, section 17,
We are gonna have to speed up on time.
I know, okay. I think I just have a couple more.
Okay.
Section 175430, requirements for an application. It says here to provide a copy of a rental agreement, rental rules and regulations, as required. And in some of the other ordinances, I did not find this as a requirement, and I don't really understand why it's here or what the goal is in having it stay in So I was just, would request that maybe
So
we
that
consider.
was one of the last things Sandy and I talked about, and there's a good likelihood that that will be suggested to be struck from, because the understanding is, as a client of Airbnb, you are under an agreement in that situation, so this is, again, seems to be duplicative.
Is that the case for all the competitors?
I would think so. I would think so, that in order to contact through them, that you have to
Now, wouldn't
comply with certain
think-
regulations.
part of the objective be to know that there are rules?
I think, what I saw in a couple of other ordinances is that they had a required signage that you had to post in the units themselves, that the city required you to have posted with the rules.
I think the objective was simply to know that there's
Yeah.
rules.
Um,
And
and then again, on the rules, it says that, you have to have every renter sign an agreement acknowledging the house rules. I found that a little onerous, because usually, I think through Airbnb, when you set your rules and when they sign on, that's basically agreeing to the rules. So I didn't know if, like, you have to have every single person sign one before they, or what that exactly meant. Again, I think it goes back
that area is
to-
gonna be worked on a little
Okay.
further, I think. So,
Okay.
I think, staff will take that under advisement.
Okay. And then also, sorry, section 155440 permits requirement. Item 5 in section D talks about the trash cans. And I don't know for sure, but isn't this an ordinance of when you can put your cans out in cans? I don't know.
It's surprisingly not in the ordinance,
Oh, really?
because I looked for it.
Unless you're an Airbnb.
No,
I
yes.
don't know where else to look for it, but I actually looked in the ordinance, and there is no timeframe before or after that I can find.
So I did agree with the first sentence that, you should have it, but
Yes, Commissioner?
I think it's especially important for non-hosted, but
Yeah,
we definitely want to make sure that
Non-hosted is a bigger issue.
um,
Okay.
and then, prohibiting units for weddings, receptions. Maybe putting in the language something about that it's, the venue's paid to be used for that. So like if I have my own personal, child of mine has a wedding or something that, but either way, it's fine. Sorry,
It's, your Airbnb customers cannot
yes.
use your
Okay.
facility or
Yes.
any business thing like that.
And then going back to the having a building, in section, I think it's E, but it might have got cut off, so it might be F, or G. It talks about for each hosted accommodation, the owner must sleep at the vacation rental unit while being rented. And then it says the owner must reside and sleep in a bedroom not rented to any renter. Well, just like to get that maybe cleaned up a little bit. And
The challenge there is that the bedroom count is one of the ways of
Right.
determining how many guests are available.
Right.
So counting it and then loading them in and putting them in sleeping bags and then using, so it controls the number of people.
And maybe on the rental
The objective
property.
of the
Okay.
ordinance is to preserve the residential nature of the neighborhood, not to restrict the business, because it's clearly a business that people
Yeah.
want to use and people want to, like yourself, partake in, but it's to prevent it from disturbing the neighbors while it's occurring. And so that's where that comes from.
And maybe just,
Okay.
instead of rental unit, put rental property, and I think that was the end of my notes, yep.
Very thorough, and thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And staff has made some notes there.
Okay, thank you. Oh, no, you're fine.
Benny? Yes.
Hi. It's been a great privilege of mine to have the experience of welcoming people.
Your address?
It's 726 Lupine Way.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been a great privilege to have the experience of welcoming people traveling from around the world, local Winters residents and their families, as well as people in the area for business into my home in Winters over the past 2 years. Between the great restaurants, the proximity to beautiful Lake Berryessa, and the friendly people, what's not to love about this town. Similar to Matt, I didn't really appreciate how special Winters was when I purchased the house. It was mainly somewhere warmer in the East Coast for my parents to come in the winter, and it was close to Lake Berryessa. So it wasn't for the tacos, but it wasn't until I got here and really appreciated how great it was. However, I was disappointed to hear about the proposed new ordinance targeting vacation rentals. The draft proposal is marketed as an attempt to maintain the public welfare and safety, but in practicality is an attempt to extinguish vacation rentals from the city through steep financial burdens and unnecessary compliance. The need of regulation for short-term rentals is clearly based on anecdotal observations and opinions rather than actual facts. As outlined in the email from the police chief, no police incidents have been reported in the past year at short-term rental properties. The 2 incidents that are referenced to be at an apartment complex, but the possible corrected address is a short-term rental. That sounds weird, and I'm not really sure what that means, but at the end of the day, it sounds like there was no calls to any short-term rental residences in the past 12 months. The actual differences between the rental of a personal residence for 29 days compared to 31 days is inconsequential, yet the requirements between the two under the new proposition would differ vastly. The proposed requirement that the owner or agent of an unhosted vacation rental must be available in person with 1 hour upon request is an egregious example of making an unhosted vacation rental in Winters impossible. It would be ridiculous to require that same standard from a landlord renting their residence for 31 days, but the proposed ordinance finds it reasonable when renting a house for 29 days. Additionally, the draft proposal attempts to limit the number of guests based on the number of available parking spaces at a residence. If parking is an issue in Winters, then the same requirement should be implemented for all residences or a parking permit system put in place. Placing restrictions and unrealistic administrative burdens on a minority of houses doesn't make sense. Instead of regulations and threat of punitive measures, I would hope the city should focus on educating both hosts and the general public about the platforms that exist to facilitate paid short-term rentals and best practices in the effort to create a safe and non-disruptive environment. I think speaking to some of the points you brought up before, I don't want to make this specific to me. I think the conversation should be general, but based on the fact pattern you laid out, fairly confident that the house you spoke about was my residence. And just to put a different set of facts, when I spoke to Jose about the incident, he did not, when he said he asked the people several times to be quiet, when I spoke to him, he said he shushed them, which is a far cry from saying that he spoke to them. Both him and my other neighbors have agreed that when they simply ask people to, that they're being loud and to go inside, people apologize and are respectful. And while I don't think the burden should be placed on them, I think that, being in a quiet neighborhood, there's certain instances where people aren't being rowdy or disruptive, but simply the fact that noise carries. And just asking them if they can go inside, it's pretty simple. The fact of not calling the police because there would be retaliation or not speaking to them in general. One, I don't believe that in a police report it mentions who called it in, and I believe you can call it in without mentioning your name. So that fact pattern just doesn't seem to hold up, as well as the fact that I spoke to the other neighbors and they don't seem to have an issue. They said everyone's been respectful. The only thing I can imagine is that when I first talked to Jose about the situation, his response was, well, if you're running a business, I want in on it. And the fact that, he is not in on it seems to give reason to why there's a disconnect between him and the other neighbors. I spoke to John a couple weeks ago and asked to be involved in the process, similar to Sandy. He said that somebody would be reaching out, and I have not heard from that person yet. So would appreciate the being able to work through some of the nuances. And same similar to Sandy, would appreciate if it gets pushed back so that I have the opportunity to do so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yep.
We're neighbors. Commissioners, questions, comments? Are there, no, those are all. Anybody else would like to address that? We will close the public hearing on that then. I would recommend that we give Sandy and Benny the opportunity to continue to work with Dave. This is the 1-year anniversary of working on this issue. So while Sandy said she didn't understand the urgency, it is important that it gets done the best possible way. It is not the intention to discourage or to eliminate either hosted or unhosted Airbnb rentals, but it certainly is the intention to regulate and put some controls on them. If someone would make, and if thus there's other comments or other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, okay.
So for my fellow commissioners and for John, is it the intent that if we continue, we're continuing our deliberations, or did you want to also continue the public comment? I know you closed the public comment rather than continuing it to the next meeting, so what is?
Can we reopen it at the
what
next
is
meeting?
What is the wish of the public body?
I think it needs to be open at the next meeting to,
So
I'll leave it open.
can I make it through a motion? Would that be appropriate?
Yes.
Fine.
So if I could so move, I would move the continuance of this item to the next meeting, including continuing the public comment, and also look forward to hearing what staff and others bring back forward.
Before you second that, your question is?
My question is, does that mean that we're ending our discussion for tonight, or are we going to have a little bit of a study?
Why don't we
Further
have,
session.
before we do that, why don't we have any discussion?
Yeah.
While people are
So
here.
essentially,
Yeah.
once you second, you can second for purposes of discussion, so you don't have to vote for it.
Perfect, I second for purposes of discussion.
Open to discussion.
Your turn.
I once again want to urge the commissioners to look at this through the lens of what it is we're trying to solve. I think it's absolutely imperative that we, don't allow any unintended consequences to come to fruition. And I think that one example of us trying to prevent that from happening is this continuance. However, we really need to figure out whether we want some sort of a mechanism to be able to allow us to enforce rules against Airbnbs or other vacation rentals that are becoming an issue, or do we want it to be a blanket kind of overarching statement to these rentals? And I think it should be an enforcement mechanism. If you're not a good neighbor, you shouldn't be allowed the exception to run a business from your home. But to the extent that you're a good neighbor, why should we burden you with all of these regulations that the average layperson is going to have to read through over and over again and try to figure out what it is they're trying to comply with? It should be as simplified as possible, and I think Sandy's attempt is the first step. Abigail, everything you said were notes that I had, that's a great point. So I just recommend that we approach it that way. I think the commission has been deliberate in everything they've done. They've thought about it. They have legitimate concerns. I do not think this is two commissioners going rogue and trying to protect their property value somehow. I think it's very clear that citizens are concerned about this, but it needs to be done correctly, and it needs to be very crisp. You get the license, you get the permit. Hopefully, we're able to reduce the cost via making it less administratively burdensome for the city. And then as long as you play by the rules, and you enjoy your side income, enjoy having guests in your home, but to the extent that you don't, then we'll have another conversation about how to limit that. So the overarching statement that I'd like to make.
Okay. Other comments? All right. So now we've had a discussion, we vote now.
Move the question.
Hmm?
Move the question. Call the question.
Call the question. Yes, we're gonna vote, thank you. Glad you're here. So let's vote on carrying this over to the next meeting, which is, do we know the date on that?
June 25th.
June 25th, so it'll be carried over to June 25th. The public comment will be reopened at that time.
Public comment. Yes.
Yes. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Passes. Thank you very much, everyone who participated in that and for your input. And Benny Dave, right behind you, is the one you want to talk to. And he's been working with
I
Sandy.
gave him my business.
There you go. And we'll have more to hear on June 25th. Okay, great. Thank you. On to housing. And a presentation on housing issues faced by the City of Winters and other cities.
Chairman Meyer, members of the Planning Commission. So tonight, what I'd like to do is, this is a presentation I gave to the City Council at the last regular meeting, and I'd like to kind of repeat it, go over it with you, because the Planning Commission plays a very important role in a process that we're going to probably kick off sometime towards the end of summer, going into the fall, and that's talking about housing. What I'd like to do tonight is maybe go through, take it up to about 25,000 feet, and talk about some of the overarching issues that are out there. I put together a report that's included in the agenda, which hits on a lot of the key areas for you to be researching. The agenda report's 8 pages, but if you actually click on all the little blue highlights that are in there, you'll see that it probably comes out to about 1,500 pages of information about housing. So tonight I'm going to talk about 9 key areas that really surround many of the issues. We'll talk a little bit about the city's housing element. We'll talk a little bit about affordable housing, state policy, regional policy, the city's policies. We'll talk a little bit about infill housing, which is a really hot topic. Share a little bit about densities, just as far as information for your own purview. We'll talk a little bit about growth rate, because that comes up quite a bit. And I'll give you a little insight into the discussions that we have with property and landowners and folks that are coming from staff on a number of things. If you've been reading the paper lately, Governor Gavin Newsom has declared the state's housing crisis is his #1 issue. Top project with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments right now, and within the coming months, is the facilitation of what they call the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, better known as RHNA, which is a critical portion of how the city's housing element and planning goes about. The city's housing element is going to come due, and starting in 2020, going into 2021, we will be going through an update of the city's housing element. That's something that will start in the Planning Commission, and we'll be the first ones that get a look at that. There's currently a very low vacancy rate, basically 0, when it comes to any type of rental housing. Before I came down tonight, I went on Zillow and Craigslist and I tried to find anything for rent in Winters. It simply doesn't exist. Kick into the city's housing element, a couple of fun facts. It's one of the required elements of our city's general plan, which is kind of included up on the wall there. The Office of Planning and Research, which provides guidance to cities on housing elements, are put together as part of general plans, says that housing is a matter of vital statewide importance in the attainment of decent housing and suitable living environment for all Californians is a priority of the highest order. Um, Our housing element with, housing elements in general are adopted in concert with the regional housing needs allocation numbers that come out. Ours was adopted in 2013, and we got an 8-year certification on that, which was important. There's 5-year certifications, there's 8-year certifications. Within the past month, the state has literally filed lawsuits against 75 cities in California whose housing ordinances did not meet the standard, or they're not in effect. This is really small, but I'm going to try and talk about some of the key goals of the city's housing element. Essentially, there are 7 strategic goals: that there's adequate land for a balanced range of housing. Second is that the housing element is meant to encourage the maintenance, improvement, and the rehabilitation of the city's existing housing stock. Third, the idea of energy efficiency, which coincides with the state's green code and many of the greenhouse gas and climate change issues that are going on. Fourth is the idea of promoting affordable housing, and I'll talk about that because in winters it's very important. Fifth is to ensure that adequate services and a network is available for the housing that is in the community.
John?
Yeah.
We need to get Dave back.
He is
Oh,
back.
I'm sorry, I looked down there and I didn't see you. Sorry.
He's back.
I didn't see you.
Hi, Dave.
I apologize for the
He-
interruption.
He's quicker than you.
He's quick, he's back, yeah.
So item 6 is just the idea of promoting equal opportunity for housing. And then finally, it's the idea of preserving the existing affordable housing in cities, which is a major issue throughout the state of California, given where housing prices are going. The policy goals that are specific in our housing element, and I can tell you they represent the mantra of how staff approaches housing. The idea of a broad mix of housing types, inclusionary housing, you're going to hear about that quite a bit. Inclusionary housing basically means affordable housing and how it's integrated within a community. The idea that there will be multifamily units for families. If you look at the way in many urban environments, affordable housing are single rooms. In our case, the priority is on family units. The idea of expediting processing for housing. I will tell you that as the state looks at this, HCD, the governor, they are taking a beeline at how long it takes for housing to get approved, avoiding the excess housing costs. One of the topics tonight, accessory dwelling units, ADUs, the idea of secondary housing units. The state views those as affordable housing in a way that to allow that. A couple of years ago, we adopted ours in 2017 for accessory dwelling units. The state gave an exception to local planning laws to allow for accessory dwelling units with the specific goal that those units would be going on to create affordable housing. And that's why Dave kind of mentioned what he said. Mobile and manufactured housing, collaboration with nonprofits. We as a city have both, we've gotten the yin and the yang with Legal Services of Northern California. They are the leading advocacy organization for affordable housing in the core in Northern California. And we have a very distinct collaboration with them. The idea of incentives for developers to get them to produce housing, and the idea of local builders. So affordable housing in winters. Turn the page, got it. Michelle V. Winters, in 1992, the city adopted a general plan. In 1992, the city was immediately litigated against by Legal Services of Northern California. They approached the city based on one of the most important aspects of what the general plan did. When it came to the densities which would accrue towards affordable housing, the city put the majority of that zoning in the flood zone, and I'll show you on the map. In the zoning here, the highest density, this is medium-high residential, medium-high residential, high residential. These are actually the largest high-density zoning areas within the entire city. And this area up here is a flood zone. Michelle V. Winters is actually the first party of, I believe there were probably about a dozen individuals, and Mr. Michelle was the first name on the list that was submitted to the court. But for Winters, what it did, Michelle V. Winters went into a Yolo County court, and legal services was asking for one thing. They were asking for a 10% inclusionary requirement. The judge was not so impressed where the city put all the affordable housing, so he gave us a 15% inclusionary requirement. So he gave us a 50% premium on that. In the stipulation of that 15%, 6% of the housing is dedicated to very low affordable units and 9% to low and moderate income housing. It requires for annual reporting. Each year we file as part of the stipulation an overall housing report, which not only goes to the state, but also goes to legal services, and that gets to our overall collaboration with legal services. In the decision, it required a revision to the city's housing element that had been adopted in that 92 plan, coordination with the city and the city's community development agency, which was our redevelopment agency. In 2004, we issued the first debt issuance for that community development agency, roughly about $20 million. And of that money, almost $10 million of it went straight to affordable housing. In redevelopment, it was kind of 80-20. 80% went to general redevelopment, 20% went to the affordable housing side. Based on Michelle V. Winters and our stipulation, more than half went towards the affordable housing. The city established as part of the process an affordable housing steering committee, which is meant to work not only on advancement of the idea of affordable housing, but as various things like affordable housing plans that are submitted by subdividers are provided. Fun fact about our affordable housing in town, out of about 2,300 units that we have in town, 335 or 14.56% are affordable in town. Let's talk a little bit about state priorities. As I mentioned, Governor Gavin Newsom is pretty vocal about this. There are really three places that you need to think about: the governor, the State Department of Finance, and the State Department of Housing and Community Development. They provide most of the direction regarding housing policy within the state. Throughout California in 2018, there were about 77,000 units that were built throughout the state. And the governor set a goal of about 3.5 million units, which is a lot more than 77,000.
Over a period.
Over the planning period,
Yeah.
which is about 8 years. So in California, in the state legislature, and mind you, legislation comes from many sources, comes from advocates, comes from legislatures, comes from the governor. There are over 200 housing bills that are in the current legislative session. Last year was a record year for housing bills. Most of the biggest concerns that cities have is the revocation of local control over things. And not giving a hard time to ADUs, we love them, but the accessory dwelling units is a very good example of the state saying, hey, we're gonna impose something, that goes outside of your zoning requirements. Typically, within your zoning, you have lot coverage requirements, and obviously, if you allow someone to put another dwelling unit on there, you're changing the densities of the overall area. The housing bills that legislation has gone through, the big one was SB 50, which was considered quote unquote the dense housing bill. That's since been rolled back, but if you look at really what's happening right now, housing is such a high priority, rolling SB 50 back, because I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but the regional housing needs allocation process is going to start moving forward. Probably the better time when everybody, basically, practically every city within the state of California is going to be redoing their housing element. That's probably the time to hit them with the legislation to get things going. The idea of rent control and stabilization is out there. Tenant rights, preservation of existing low income housing, and tax credits. What's happening out there? It's really easy. If you have a lease, you're probably getting, in a market rate unit, if you have a lease, you're probably getting your lease looked at by your landlord. In winters right now, we have rental costs that are off the chart for winters. Our largest market rate apartment complex in town is about $1,850 a month, which is an extremely high rent. There's a little tiny 2-bedroom, 1-bath that came up on the market a couple of weeks ago that was over $1,600 a month, and that was just something that was unheard of. I've added something that I heard on the radio this morning, AB 891, and it has cleared each of the legislative committees and is probably moving on. To give you an idea of the legislature's mindset, AB 891 is an allowance for any city that has a population of 330,000. They're required to provide locations where people can live in their cars. And it's very serious legislation. I went through and I looked at it. It's pretty general, but the idea of coming up with places where people can go, the cities are required to provide security, restroom facilities, etc., where people could do that. Having my own child in just graduating from college right now, he and his roommate, they lived in the same apartment for 3 years, and they were given their notice. You're out. They were paying $900, and the rent's going to go up to about $1,700, but they're out. They have no place to live. You never think, well, gosh, homelessness, how do people not, my son, his girlfriend, his roommate, and his friend, all of them have no place to live. So it's a pretty serious issue because the amount of housing out there is done. Looking online, it says that 1 in 7 students in the CSU system is either homeless or living in their cars. Lots going on. Let's talk about the regional housing needs allocation. The Sacramento Area Council of Government is our regional planning body, SACOG. They are given numbers that being the regional planning agency, the way that it works is that the Department of Finance comes up with the housing need, which is then transferred down to the State Department of Housing and Community Development. The numbers are provided to the regional planning bodies that kind of divvied up based on jobs and housing, and they're expecting that as part of the upcoming process that the numbers are going to go up pretty significantly Usually if there's gonna be consternation in a community, it's when the RENA numbers come out. Because within the planning period, they're gonna say, gosh, Winters, you have to provide X hundreds of houses during that planning period. And they want you to establish a housing element and a process on how to actually achieve that goal. One of the things that we've heard talked about is that we've included and we plan on doing what is known as a general plan refresh. One of the things that the Office of Planning and Research for the state, which is kind of the policy side with general plans, OPR, the revision to general plans is based to increase transparency, understandability of the general plans. But one of the biggest things is the idea that you're going to put in standards and produce the actual numbers that you're going to need. You put those in, they can be evaluated. And that is one of the things that they're looking at as far as the various numbers. Now, the RENA numbers coincide with what they call the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That all has to do with literally billions of dollars throughout the state of California. I mentioned HCD is the one who oversees that. Part of the way that SACOG will work is that the RENA numbers come out, the cities work on their housing elements, the cities will adopt those numbers. SACOG will put together what is known as a regional housing needs plan. That will be for an 8-year period, and then all the housing elements move forward and are updated and submitted to the state. In the staff report, I've provided quite a few city policies that you can get yourself up on a little bit. I mentioned the housing element, the city's land use element, which provides zoning and densities for that. I mentioned the inclusionary housing, 15% citywide. Whenever we deal with anything regarding housing, it gets into the inclusionary housing. One of the things that I've included is a link, housing tools based on state policy. Now, the housing tools book that I included has all their recommendations, some of the best practices that are being used by cities. And for us, and in the toolkit, it includes many of the things that we've already adopted. Accessory dwelling units, single room occupancy requirements, farm worker housing, supportive housing, and transitional housing. All those represent different policies and different types of housing that affect different groups. Infill housing, super great buzzword. What does it mean? It's the idea of maybe looking within a more urban core within your community and figuring out how to take land and possibly use the idea of mixed uses and going vertical. In the city of Winters, our infill housing is based on 2 main documents. One is the city's downtown master plan, and as part of that, we have a document known as our form-based code. The form-based code allows for a very wide variety of different types of uses that can go within our master plan area. And when it comes to housing and the density of housing, it actually hits on our highest density count, 28 units to the acre. I always yell at the staff for putting up slides that nobody can read. So here's mine. But anyway, in the staff report, if you go online, this is all in the staff report. It's much better in the staff report. I just felt the need to include this in there. But anyway, I've included just information on our housing. Colors and the corollary zoning districts, A1, RR, R1, R2, R3, R4, C1, Central Business District, FB, the form-based code area, are all included in there. And I encourage you to take a look at it. So numbers, wow, how fast have we been growing? Well, you know what I did? I didn't even include the almost 10 years that we had zero growth. So I've tried to forecast out the build out of practically everything that we have entitled in the city right now. This has to do with single family homes. 2016 was the first year that we actually started to see a surge of any residential construction. That was, and what this represents is the start of the Winners Ranch project. And then what I've done is I've put in numbers that we haven't even come close to achieving yet. 34 units is about 1.4%. 2018 goes through what was the build out of the Winners Ranch project. And that was building at a very robust pace. And for this year, we think maybe that we might get to 54 units. Just kind of a rule of thumb, one of the things that we've learned from the financing, from talking to the various subdividers and home builders, is that financing typically is in blocks of 16 units. The lenders will go within that scope. So you build 16 and then you can build 16 more and then 16 more. The number that we came up with, it takes about 5 months to build a house, from pulling the permit to getting the certificate of occupancy. So what we've done is we've taken everything. Right now we have 3 builders in town, and I tried to give my best estimation of that. We would click into about 78 units, which quite frankly doesn't take into effect the Stones Throw subdivision will be moving to their second phase. Anybody who was paying attention out there, it took them almost 2 years to get all the infrastructure in. So there's a chance that we may see a little bit of a lag. But through 2025, this kind of gives you a little bit of a snapshot. And this ultimately is the build out of everything that we have entitled. So what's staff telling people who are landowners, developers, etc.? A lot in the paper about talking with developers, and when we talk to people who own property, who would be a developer, what are we telling them? Number one is the idea is that we as a city are an advocate for the housing element in the city's general plan. Every day, if it's kind of like being at Notre Dame and slapping the sign going out of the locker room, our mantra is we have to follow the housing element and the general plan. As we follow that housing element, I mentioned the strategic goals, the policy goals. Those are the specific things that we're talking with them about. As far as areas that need to be planned, we are absolutely talking with people about planning. One of the misnomers of everything, cities have entire departments called planning departments or community development departments that do nothing but land use. When you get into the core of what the city is doing, we deal in land. That's part of the business of the city. My goodness, you're the planning commission. Planning commissions review proposals for a wide variety. You set policy regarding those things. And the idea that staff is talking with people who own property and are looking at ideas for things that they're going to do, we absolutely talk to them about that. Both big and small, whether it's somebody coming in that wants to have an accessory dwelling unit onto their property, all the way to somebody that wants to look to annex property into the city. That's the way that cities do it. If you want to get really spooky about everything, some cities have economic development departments that are actually going out and trying to actively bring them and cut deals. Jobs and housing is very important. As we talk with developers about the priorities of the city, the ability to bring jobs and match that with the housing in town is absolutely critical. June 4th, we're going to have a joint session between the city council and the planning commission to talk about the economic development committee's recommendations. We're going to talk a lot about that because the recommendations of that report all coincide with the idea of creating jobs so that they can match the housing. Market rate rental housing. Within the past couple of weeks, we've had a property owner come in and they've got about a 2.5 acre piece of their property, and they go, well, what would go here? And I mean, literally we're screaming at them, market rate rental. Desperately needed in this community. We have 0 vacancy right now. One question, if you were to lose your housing today, where would you go to live? Where would you go? The idea that you live within an area where there is 0 availability of anything, where would you go? The closest rental was a 1-bedroom, 1-bath in Dixon that I could find this afternoon. Where would your dogs go? Where would you go if you had kids? Where would you commute from if you had children? Are you going to bring them back to Winters? Think about the people in Paradise. There's no place to go. So we're telling them market rate rental housing. One of the problems with that is that it's wildly expensive. The person I was talking with, he said, got nothing for you. I've got nobody who's building apartments right now. The typical apartment for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, and we kind of kick this around for affordable housing. The Blue Mountain Terrace project, it's probably $340,000, $350,000, $360,000 a unit. That's for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment. On the market rate, they're saying that it's probably in the $240,000, $250,000 range of the cost for those. Very expensive. The idea of affordable housing. My goodness, look at our economy. We're blessed. We live in the breadbasket of the world. We grow the best food in the world in Winters, California. But we have people who need to make, they aren't making very much. If you click on the link we fall within the Solano County region for our housing. To qualify for a market rate rental unit, you need to make $36 an hour. That's $74,880 a year. I mean, you could be the best college student that ever graduated from any school. The idea that you're going to immediately nail that job at $75,000. No. Ask how many people are living with roommates. Ask how many people are even making that. Very expensive. We talk about downtown infill on projects, trying to get people to go vertical in our downtown. Our downtown master plan is predicated on the idea that we become a 24-hour downtown. So as we talk with property owners about various things, I'm always pushing out the idea, hey, what about some reuse on some of these properties? Put some commercial downstairs, maybe a little bit of office, and then go vertical on some type of residential. And then finally, the last thing that we're telling people is the spectrum of housing. I can't tell you how many times when we have any type of subdivision that comes in, what's the first thing that everybody throws at us is either the houses are too big, so we want smaller houses, or hey, why aren't we building big houses on big lots? It's that spectrum. So as we talk with people, we point at the various aspects of the city's zoning map and say, here are some of the things that we're looking for. Just in closing, housing is going to be a big issue. It's a major issue in the state of California, and it's something that's not going to go away. As we as a community look, people will point and say, my goodness, you're building a bunch of houses right now. Well, not everybody can afford a $500,000 house. And especially folks in winters, we have a certain portion of our community that we know cannot afford to go out and pay $500,000 and $600,000 for a house. And that goes throughout the whole state of California. Our ability to facilitate quality housing, rental housing, hit that sweet spot, maybe on a little bit smaller size houses where the costs are a little bit lower. Lots of challenges, and I will tell you that the Planning Commission will be one of the first ones. You all are going to get it because as we move forward, there'll be workshops and things that we do regarding our housing element. You'll be one of the first places that gets that, and I can assure you when the housing element comes up, you're the first place that's going to get it. And it's going to include all the RENA numbers with a lot of policy. So this was just an information item. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Yes, Dave. I'm glad you're here.
So, does the already entitled but unbuilt housing go to some of our RENA that's going to be declared? Or does it have to be all new entitlement or zoning?
No, that's a great question. Yeah, basically, we need to do some projections. Now, how you come up with that, SACOG has an overall formula. So it's a little bit yes, a little bit no. Because the houses that we have entitled right now and are moving towards construction, they fall within, we currently have our housing element right now. So you have to get some brownie points towards what you have right now. But some things that are moving forward. We have some entitlements of things that haven't moved forward yet. So yes and no.
Okay.
Okay, but one of the things that all of you, we will absolutely make sure we get is how the formula comes out. There's the kind of the black box of the RENA process involved the allocation of a formula. So credit for what you have versus what you don't have.
And another question too would be, do we have enough land in our planning area to meet whatever this will be?
No, unless the RENA numbers are just rockets, yes, we do. But realize that part of that involves, as you look at the overall density, one of the number one things that they will tell you in the housing element is that you need to have the zoning for the units. And we will probably easily make that. Conversely, though, we also have challenges because as we build out, if you just take this is a nice easy line. We actually have a flood overlay zone that kind of dips down and does kind of this. If we just take this line right here, all of this is zoned and entitled already. It goes up to Moody Slough. This is already zoned. It's got a partial entitlement, but doesn't have subdivision in it. But everything north is zoned, but definitely not entitled.
And are we required to actually have this happen? The RENA number actually has to happen over the 8-year period, or we just have to make our best attempt? Or?
You're supposed to make your best try at it. But if you look at just the way that housing legislation is coming down, there's a lot less carrot and a lot more stick. Mainly, the governor has just come out and said it. SB1, those gas tax monies, that may be the carrot and the stick. The carrot, if you're achieving your housing numbers, you're going to get the road monies. If you're not, they've said that this is the number one issue.
In the workshop we were at, they mentioned, it, and I guess it was over each planning period, that if you go throw some zoning out there, kind of like in the flood zone, you go throw some zoning out there and go, there, we got it, we're good. But nothing happens because it either wasn't good zoning, wasn't doable, whatever. There'll be a period of time when they go, okay, that one's off the table. You can't use that one anymore. You have to come up with more. So you can't just do a map and then hope it flies. They will knock out things over a period of time where nothing happens.
Yeah,
Everyone else's.
well, and one of the things, is we've talked about kind of refreshing our general plan a little bit as far as the language goes. One of the reasons why we're kind of stepping back a little bit and waiting to move on all that stuff, because as the RENA numbers come out and the Housing and Community Development Department for the state starts moving forward on things, the format, how these things are going to look at, HCD is going to have a format for how it goes. And the idea of setting up standards and benchmarks for various things. The good news about computers and technology and the upgrades and all these things is it makes running data a lot easier than it was in the past. 2 cycles ago, you just submitted these big, thick documents full of everything, and maybe they caught you, maybe they didn't. Now, guess what? Everything is going into a state database, and they're going to either give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Those numbers are either going to go green or they're going to go red. How did you achieve everything? Every year, there's a state housing report that's submitted. How did you do? And if you're not making it, the governor said that there are consequences.
Well, I think if I could, I think one of the things that you'll see in these 200 bills or presage of that is that I think communities run the risk, either in general in California or specifically for those who don't own housing, of having a lot of their land use zoning entitlement obligations become by right in order to be able to effect the housing construction that they need. So that is one area in which you kind of have to find the balance there as well, or that will be another piece of that stick.
By right mandates, market rate labor.
Not necessarily, but for example, ADUs are already a good example. The state believes that
All they're gonna do is change the rule.
so the state believes that ADUs can be a source of affordable housing by design, and therefore they have basically said to cities, you can't say no to ADUs. So there's one example right there where in order to get affordable living space, the state has set aside zoning requirements by cities.
Some people wanted to make comments. We will open this at 8:02 to public comment and start with Kate Lanish.
Thank you, Chairman Hyde. Kate Laddish, 400 Morgan Street, number 21. And thank you to pardon me, let me get into the right document because that'd be really helpful here. Otherwise, I'm gonna start reading about who's coming to the phones. All right, so thank you to the Planning Commission and the City Manager for looking ahead about the upcoming update to the housing element of the general plan and also considering how we're going to meet the RENA numbers when SACOG releases those. So a couple comments just in a few different categories. The first one's looking at the housing element, RENA, and housing density. So as we move into updating the housing element, doing the general plan refresh that the city manager referred to just a moment ago, and completing the climate action plan or considering any proposals from developers, we could set ourselves up for RENA success by considering increasing the density and pursuing infill, as the city manager described in his report. So looking ahead, the densities envisioned currently in the general plan and zoning ordinance for future development in the north area are not compatible with anything but the suburban bedroom community kind of sprawl patterns. And these would not comport to the current goals of SACOG, the region served by SACOG or the state. And building in that style would not help us meet the RENA numbers. Adding land to the area covered by our general plan and building houses on that land also wouldn't help us meet the RENA numbers that would be established for our current general plan area, as our allocation will just go up if and when we choose to add land to our planning area. So that's a point neither for nor against future annexation or adding land to the area, but it's just something to consider as we move forward. And so looking at housing affordability and availability, I'd recommend that the city consider novel ways of increasing the affordability, density, and climate compatibility of the housing that we plan for and approve. I appreciate that the city manager is considering rental availability and that also considering the market rate rental housing. Building more of what we're currently building, especially the single family homes, and have already approved is unlikely to improve that situation. And so if increasing rental availability is a goal, let's learn what's worked in other locations and may be likely to work here and explore doing that. So for example, would encouraging development of co-housing help as a way of increasing the density and the affordability? Let's find out. So I also suggest that let's take steps to maintain the current affordable housing stock and remain aware that properties currently in subsidy programs can time out of affordability and become market rate. For example, when owners of properties in the USDA Rural Development Program repay their loans, the subsidy ends, and the owners can choose to leave the program and turn the property into market rate units, which I guess would increase our stock of market rate apartments, but would decrease our stock of affordable housing. So this is part of what's precipitating a growing statewide and nationwide crisis in rural affordable housing. A reporter from the Christian Science Monitor actually used Winter Senior Apartments, which is the address that I give whenever I speak here, the 400 Morgan Street. So this reporter from the CS Monitor used Winter Senior Apartments as a case study for an article that he wrote in late December of looking at this. And certainly if any of the commissioners or staff have questions about the experience of living in one of these affordable complexes, I'd be happy to talk with you at some point in the future. So looking at job housing balance, the city manager and I've talked in a separate forum at one of the Ask the City Manager sessions about trying to learn specifically what sorts of jobs would keep people from commuting out of winters and what sorts of houses would work for the jobs that we try to create in winters, so that we can develop these two synchronously rather than developing two different things that wouldn't end up working together. And finally, with all the discussion of RENA numbers and trying to understand what we can do going forward with this, and since so much of this is going to end up driving the housing element update, that I would just suggest that the Planning Commission ask the staff to invite SACOG Senior Planner Greg Chu to come just give a presentation about the RENA numbers so that we have that basic information moving forward and can figure out how that plugs into our housing element. Thank you.
Thank you. Quick question. Yes, Kate. Yeah.
Yes.
What is co-housing?
It is.
We've never been to Dayton.
I know, it sounds deeply groovy. It is not necessarily, you don't have to eat granola necessarily in co-housing. So there's, the co-housing that I'm most familiar with is actually Glacier Circle co-housing because some friends helped build it. And so it's, in that case, it's that each person or each couple actually owns a townhome, and so they're attached, but then there's also a common house. And so it's a way that, in that case, people can actually be a property owner, and yet there's shared space. And so for them, it's been a way to cut down costs, but also increase density. And I have a feeling that Commissioner Baker has some input on this.
Well, there are actually a variety of models, of which that is one model. So co-housing may or may not have only, for example, joint kitchen and living spaces, and then smaller spaces with maybe a utility kitchen, or be more like a townhome with a small kitchen and a larger community space. Sometimes that will happen where people will buy a small apartment building and condoize it and create the shared space for that community. Most often successful when they're an intentional community of like-minded folks. And then there are cooperatives, and then there are other forms of co-housing as well. So there's a variety of models in that. Most of these models developed in Scandinavia and in particular, where they are most successful.
So, yeah, basically, yes, there are a number of different models, and it's another way to just kind of get at the issue of density and affordability. And in many cases, of also creating community. So with the shared spaces. And friends that I have that live in a number of these have had a variety of experiences, most of them very good and kind of informed things as they move forward. And I should not have dissed granola earlier. But yeah, it sounds, it sounds more commune-ish, but it's the code. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anybody else like to address this issue, John?
I'll
Yes.
point out just one thing. So Ms. Lash brought this up at the city council. Now, Greg Shu is the guy on RENA and all that. There are 58 cities and 6 counties that he's going to be going to. And are we going to get Greg Shu? We are. One time. So we're actually going to wait for everything. We're going to wait for the meat to get out on the plate so that we can have them at that thing. So
You can explain the actual numbers.
Kate's absolutely right. Well, he would probably love to come to Winters right now.
Yeah.
Nope. We're gonna wait till the hook's in and for him to come. So
Okay.
it'll be later than sooner.
Would anyone else like to address this issue?
I just want to make some comments if I could.
Yes, please.
So I really want to thank the city manager and staff for bringing this forward. I think it's a very important issue. In particular, I think it's a very fraught issue, especially for our children becoming adults, for young families, for school districts, for the health of our community as a whole. We were blessed in my day job to have some migrant farmer for housing that was vacant during the winter, and we were able to repurpose that for refugees from the Butte fire. So we were able to actually work firsthand with folks who thought their lives were settled and their houses were paid for, and that they were going to be enjoying that section of their life, only to find that at the end of the day, they actually had absolutely nothing and had to start over, and really had to rely on the kindness of strangers throughout the state of California. And if we followed the diaspora from the Paradise Fire, they are from Hawaii to the East Coast, all looking for a space and a new place to call home. So it behooves us to be really mindful about both ourselves and our neighbors, and really the duty we owe to each other.
Thank you. We will now close the public comment at 8:12. Staff comments, we skipped that on the way in. We had a great youth day, and John and Charlie, thank you for putting on a great pancake breakfast. And Commissioner Riley, if he was here, who, as always, works on the parade and getting the floats all lined up and everything. So a lot of involvement in the city. Any other comments?
Great youth day.
Great youth day. Great duck race too, even though I didn't win. I never win. At 8:13, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Hey, well, how are you, Al?
Hey,
Jack.
Your name in the paper?
Oh, yeah.
New job.
I did,